Why is it important that you have control of your own data? And not just data that you have personally created, but stuff that you've collected from the past. Welcome back to another T-Rex Talk. I have a guest today, my brother David Botkin, who is the CFO of T.Rex Arms, to talk about this issue. By the time that people watch this episode, a T.Rex Labs video will have just dropped explaining how you back up files, how you download a digital library, start collecting books and magazines from Gutenberg and Stack Exchange and Wikipedia offline backup copies, stuff like that. So why is that important? Why is it important that people actually maintain, access to information that, either can't be trusted because the cloud providers can't be trusted, or they can't be trusted because the information is constantly in flux and you can never go back and reference previous historical facts?
Yeah, so I'd say it's a mix of all of the things that you listed. It could be, you want to have access to your information in the event that there's any sort of grid down, grid interruptions. Could also be the getting canceled thing. It could also be you don't want the cloud going through and deleting stuff that it thinks you shouldn't have.
Yeah.
There've been some examples of that.
Sometimes accidents, sometimes not accidents.
Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes they think they know better than you.
Yeah. Sometimes. Yeah. Yeah.
So lots of good reasons to do it.
So let's go back to more of a kind of a philosophical thing, because there are some people who believe that the past doesn't matter. If information can be lost, then the information deserved to be lost, kind of thing. We have to rise constantly to greater and greater things.
Isn't that what
on
got
the
the
footsteps
library
of our dead selves?
Isn't that what got the Library of Alexandria burned?
Well, that was complicated. That was a little bit more different. There were a couple of large Islamic purges of information that basically the conquering heroes, and some of this is apocryphal because there's not great records of this, because what was stated by the conquering commanders was, if the information in this library is aligned with the Quran, then it is unnecessary because we have the Quran. And if it is not aligned with the Quran, then it should be destroyed because it's not aligned with the Quran.
And they just burned it.
Right, and that is why that quote is apocryphal, because that quote is debatably aligned with the Quran or not aligned with the Quran, depending on which scholars you ask.
Yeah.
So large amounts of information have been lost in the past. The Library of Alexandria is a good example, but there's a lot of stuff that has just kind of disappeared. And interestingly, I think we lost a ton of 1990s information. Not the 90s, but the 1990s. Yeah. There's a fascinating story. Have I told you this one about a man who remembered a song that he'd heard on the radio throughout the 90s? And he could not find the song anywhere. He could remember the lyrics perfectly, and it was just unfathomable to him and his friends that a song could have existed in the 90s and disappeared. Because there's songs from the 70s, the 60s, the 50s. Every artist from that time, we have their stuff. And then today, every artist has their entire catalog on SoundCloud. So occasionally you find these little holes in history.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's so I think that we're starting to get to a point where we just so assume that everything, all the information that exists is on the internet. So I think we're getting very spoiled because there's a lot of stuff that if no one has digitized it and gotten it up somewhere that's publicly accessible and easy to search, it's gone. It's very interesting. Some types of military history research, there's just these total voids. The paper books still have it. I suspect the Library of Congress still has it, but the internet does not appear to have it.
Right.
So it's not quite as all-encompassing as maybe we sometimes think that it is.
And some of that niche research is the stuff that is the first to go. Obviously, there are, guys like Ernest Hemingway will always be famous. His books will always be in print somewhere. But there are little niche specific publishing houses that did one or two runs of a book on a specific war. You have a fantastic encyclopedia, which I don't think is in print anymore, called War in Peace.
Yes, and I got that from a library that was liquidating. It appeared they were liquidating a lot of their military history books, and so I picked that up, and because it's not just the internet that purges stuff; it is also libraries that purge stuff.
Yes.
Interestingly.
You have to make room for all the new young adult fiction that is coming. And so you get rid of old military history encyclopedias that no longer exist.
Yeah.
Everybody knows that saying. If you forget your history, you are doomed to repeat it.
Yep.
And that word doomed immediately makes you think of like the lessons of the past. If you forget them, then you'll make the mistakes of the past. But there's another half to that statement as well. If you forget all the work and study that created good, solid knowledge, if you forget that knowledge, you got to redo all that work to figure that stuff out again.
When you said doomed to repeat it, I immediately thought of Doom.
Oh, yes. Well, yeah. Oh, do you want to talk about video games? Do you want to get back to military history? Because there's a bunch of hard-fought, hard-learned lessons that were well documented.
Yeah.
And if you forget that stuff, then you have to hard-fought, hard-learn all those lessons again from scratch. You have to reinvent things that were already invented.
Do you want to talk about that, or do you want to talk about servers, or do you want to talk about
servers?
Well,
so video games are interesting. There's a similar thing where old original video games have been well documented, well recorded, well supported.
There's been a big preservation effort.
There's been a preservation effort of the old video games. At the time that we are recording this podcast right now, there are 3 people inside of Nintendo Wii servers trying to keep them alive.
Oh, wow.
There are Nintendo Wii games that cannot be played without server support. And people that bought the consoles, bought the games, would like to keep playing them, have to stay logged into the servers to keep them alive.
Yeah.
And so there is this kind of middle ground where old games have been well supported, new games are still available, and then there's this no man's land.
So the video game preservationists out there who view preserving video games as they're like little miniature historians.
Yes, it is a solemn duty.
They have a big problem with the server-based games, the massively multiplayer online type, because when those servers shut down, the game is no longer playable, period, at all. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, data has become very transient, very impermanent, very fragile. When it becomes digital, you have the ability to copy it lots of places, which is good for redundancy, but you have to actually do that.
Right.
And if you just put it in one spot and assume that one spot is safe, that doesn't work well.
Well, and I think this is one of the biggest arguments for running something like your own server. It doesn't have to be a full-blown server, but some way to store your own data at home and not on the cloud. Because the cloud is really useful. In fact, I've gone from being pretty anti-cloud to much more accepting of the cloud. It's still Skynet.
Yes.
But it's a useful Skynet for now.
As long as you don't depend on it entirely.
Yes, because I would strongly recommend against using it as a total backup, which is what the cloud data providers do want you to do. Like they push you so hard, like, hey, buy a Google phone and get Google Drive space to back up all your photos. Your phone doesn't need to have a ton of storage space on board because you just put it all in our cloud. And that's not a great strategy, I don't think.
Well, and there's several different things. You mentioned accidents, the kind of accidents that we refer to as accidents.
Yeah.
But then there's also purposeful deplatforming of people. But then there's also purposeful deplatforming of certain kinds of information. So there are people that have not been deplatformed from Google services, but their files are no longer accessible because they're problematic in some way.
So one of my favorite examples of deplatforming of information is if you go on YouTube, you can find all kinds of great music.
Sure.
Specifically
this is not today's music.
Specifically military music from eras past.
Yes.
And the people that collect German military music from, say, the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, etc., and then put this on YouTube, that gets deplatformed regularly because Germans equals Nazis, of course. So any patriotic German song is a Nazi song, even if it was written in the 1400s, and it has nothing to do with anything Adolf Hitler would have aligned with, except Germany. But that's itself, and so you'll often see these videos like, this has gotten deleted 3 times. I'm putting it up again. This is not a Nazi song. And sometimes people even put it right in the title of the song, or in the video file itself. This is not a Nazi song. This is here for historical purposes, etc. Because the zeal for
Purges.
Purging all the Nazi information from the internet is strong.
Well, and it involves...
Except memes.
Well, here's the other thing that happens, which is fascinating. Once you lose that historical foundation, you no longer have a leg to stand on when you make your argument that this isn't a Nazi song.
Right.
If you would like to argue that there is an older Teutonic tradition, but there is no data left to support that position, you're in an awkward spot.
Right. So there's literally been, and I look at Russian and German and a bunch of different nationalities of military music, but there have been ones where I'm like, man, I want to go back and hear that German one, and it's just gone.
Yeah.
It is no longer to be found. It may reappear again later, but yeah. Now the Russian stuff, it never gets deplatformed.
Interesting. I mean, there was a period that is very strange. I think there's a period coming where Russian stuff will get deplatformed pretty widely.
Yeah, that would not surprise me.
Yeah, but for a long time, the people who control the information on some of these platforms were very pro Russia because Russia had these nice, friendly Soviet vibes left over from Uncle Joe. It's just cozy. Other Uncle Joe, different Uncle Joe, previous Uncle Joe, almost as old as our current Uncle Joe. Yeah,
Mustache Uncle Joe.
Mustache Uncle Joe. Thank you. Yes. So there's another factor that is coming as well. So in addition to data being deplatformed because it is verboten and memory hold, data also gets rewritten and tweaked. And generally speaking, this is a very time-intensive and difficult process. It is very, very hard to actually rewrite past information because the past produced so much information, so much data. But it's now much more achievable for two reasons. Number one, nobody goes back and looks at source documents anymore. They just look at the Wikipedia article. Rewriting Wikipedia articles is not hard. Right. But then the other thing is AI tools allow you to rewrite vast amounts of data very, very quickly. So in the past, you remember when Barnes & Noble came out with their Nook ebook reader?
Yeah.
They were the very first one they came out with, they were competing with the Amazon Kindle. And they were in a hurry to compete. So they just copied and pasted a ton of stuff. And then they did a quick find replace across their library to make sure that the word Kindle had been replaced with Nook. And so you are reading these books like, old books, Geppetto nooked a candle. Like they finded and replaced the word wholesale across their free Nook library, and that was the result. But AI tools are more sophisticated, where that kind of, ham-handed historical revisionism is a lot harder to detect if you have the right tools.
Right.
So it's an interesting future.
I've seen some different examples of that mass find replace, and it doesn't always work so great.
Yeah. But the new tools are more sophisticated, they're more subtle. So another reason to have untouched, untainted backups of historical files.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of different places to go from there.
Why is historical revisionism such a powerful tool? Why is it something that people really, really, really need to do?
Well, I think it all boils down to anytime, so I have kids, you have kids. Anytime a dispute arises with the kids, between the kids,
I can see where this is going.
It's always, this is what happened, and a selection of things that might be facts is presented as the cause for the war,
the cause for the disagreement, the justification.
And then you go over here and you talk to the other kid, and you're like, oh, that's why this happened, and you start to flesh it out, and I think that's just a little example of why historical revisionism is so prevalent. People want to change the facts or present only a selection of the facts that would justify their position, and then they squelch any other facts and silence them.
Yeah. Does that mean there has to be a giant, perfectly coordinated conspiracy for this to happen?
No. I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think it's just totally natural that people will want to expunge the information that makes them look bad.
Yeah. You can see this happening in real time on places like Twitter. First of all, Twitter is a terrible place to talk about history because you have to turn everything into tiny little sound bites.
Yeah.
But you can see people presented with facts they've never seen before or never heard of before. They've never gotten a memo from the conspirators telling them that this is the way that you treat the Armenian genocide, for example.
Right.
But they immediately know, like, my position is X. This fact that I've just heard of out of the blue and have never thought about before in my life does not jive with what I want the world to be. So I'm going to reject it without any coordination from masterminds in the WEF.
So I have not been on Facebook in absolutely forever, but interestingly, so there was a Christian Bible college in Kenya, and some I believe there were Islamic terrorists went in there, rounded everybody up, and just executed them. And it was about 150 people that died total. And so I posted about it on Facebook, and immediately had someone jumping on me saying, like, this is a false flag, you're just perpetuating the narrative. And it's like, he couldn't even place Kenya on a map probably. But it was that same thing where he sees it and he just attaches it to, he has a matrix for how he interprets the world. And so every other school shooting he's ever heard of, he's put in the false flag category. So now this one in Africa, he's doing the same thing with. It was very interesting.
Yeah.
And
it is fascinating the way that this works. So this idea that, well, first of all, there are conspirators. At this point, conspiracy theories have largely turned out to be true, and yet there doesn't have to be a super big overarching directive that comes down.
Central control. No.
Yeah. But once you give people an underlying worldview that they need to preserve, and if you let people grow up in a postmodern world, believing that facts are subjective and not objective, and that people have their own truth, it's just so much easier to do this kind of thing.
Yeah. This is why I like original sources. There's so much stuff that people are pushing on the internet. Anytime I'm looking at some major claim that's important, that any sort of decisions would be based off of, I try to go back to original sources as much as possible. And one of the good things is oftentimes those original sources are readily available on the internet, or you can get back pretty jolly close, and you're not just looking at a meme that has been reposted, edited, and reposted numerous times, and now that's your source of truth. You can go way back.
Yeah. So do you remember that book that came out when we were kids, How the Irish Saved Civilization? It was a pretty popular book at the time, and all it was doing was just documenting the fact that tons of classical documents from the ancient world happened to end up in these monasteries in Ireland. And as the rest of various European wars raged and documents were lost and barbarians did barbarian things, Ireland was an island, and these monks were bored, and they just copied documents over and over and over again. And as a result, you ended up with a really good library of the ancient world and a lot of stuff being preserved hundreds or thousands of miles away from the original source documents, with enough distribution and enough diffusion that you could actually do error correcting between copies. And I think that is a very important lesson. Now, you can also rely a little too much on the past. Part of the reason that people talk about the Dark Ages is medicine was pretty abysmal at that time, and part of the reason that medicine was pretty abysmal at certain times, certain places, not everywhere, people had too high of an opinion of Galen and Hippocrates and some of the ancient Greek writers. It's like, these are the documents, this is the source, we have to go with these things.
These are the humors.
These are the humors, yeah. It's indisputable, it's old enough that it's indisputable. So there can't be that level of untested faith in documents simply because they are old. They have to be tested. They have to be tested against and they have to be tested against the copies that exist, because there's also random forgeries that show up.
That whole thing.
So it's a fascinating thing. The preservation of information is vital to human civilization. And so the terrifying thing to me is not so much that Google Cloud makes mistakes, that we're building these gigantic AIs that we can't control. Like, those are all just like normal sci-fi nonsense that we're going to
Yeah.
deal with because we live in the future. It's
Yeah.
the idea that there is information that should be destroyed and rewritten so that we can win political points
Yeah.
in the next election.
Right.
That mentality, that attitude is how you get actual dark ages.
Yeah, and there's this other thing that it's really interesting. We live in this age where more information has been more readily available than ever before. And we see, I don't know if it's more people than ever before, but we see just this total willingness to accept tiny sound bites as major statements of fact.
Yes.
And it's very interesting. So anytime there's anything really big going on, like I said earlier, try to go back to source documents, and they're usually very easy to find.
Yes.
So in the whole debate over the Stop the Steal and Trump and all that, like you could go find the actual PDF dumps of affidavits, the affidavits that were being used in court, and you could go read them yourselves.
But most people didn't want to do that.
But no, exactly.
Yeah.
And so, but that's an example of a place you could actually do your own reading. And that would be more helpful than reading from an echo chamber. And it's really interesting. You can see echo chamber mentality, I would say, on both sides of the political aisle, but that implies that there's two sides.
There's two sides.
And that's not how it works at all.
There's two wings to the same dragon. Yeah.
There's two. Anyway, there's this very interesting. I like forums as a place to read from because you can get a lot of different perspectives, and sometimes they will link to or point to different information sources that can then go and be tracked down and looked at and examined. But there's a conservative site called ar15.com. It's generally speaking conservative. Yes. Whatever that means.
It's Republican.
And then there's a liberal site called Democratic Underground.
Yes.
And it's interesting to look at both and see what people are saying.
Yeah.
The goal is in doing this, is not to discover truth is the consensus of what all people say. No, that's not what's going on. But it's like, oh, that's how they're reacting to this. This is very interesting.
Yeah.
And sometimes we as conservatives will see a thing happen, like, oh no, this thing just happened in the government. Biden is about to come and take every single gun in the entire world that has ever existed, and we will all go to jail, and the UN will, like...
That's the tweets, yeah.
Right, that's how the tweet storm goes. And then you'll go over to Democratic Underground when something happens, and the liberals will be wringing their hands like, oh no, Donald Trump is about to come and put every single woman in jail.
Yeah, I saw somebody make the claim that Republicans have stated they're going to create a registration of all pregnant women. Why can't we just register guns instead? It's like...
And
how many ways to...
and then the infighting that we sometimes see in conservative circles, where it's like, we're in this situation because you supported this third-party candidate, and now this has happened. And you see the exact same thing over on the liberal side. We're like, you voted for Bernie, and then the Bernie people are like, yeah, we have Biden because you wouldn't support Bernie, and it's very interesting.
Yeah. So it is interesting watching the tech companies develop different information sharing tools.
Yeah.
And now ultimately most of them have become ad providers. The tool exists to bring eyeballs to an area so that ads can be sold in the space. That's how it's gone. But there are different ways of doing these. Forums are great for certain types of conversations. And part of the reason that I think a lot of people gravitated to places like Twitter and Reddit and stuff like that, there are these algorithms that theoretically allow the cream to rise to the top. So you have the advantage of massive amounts of information and huge numbers of comments, and the cream will just magically rise to the top, and you can get the best of the best from the thing. But what that does is it makes everything kind of non-linear, and you lose some of the archival value of the conversation as it happens, say, on an old-fashioned clunky
forum,
bulletin board forum type thing. Books don't exist as a place to get quotes out to put on Twitter. Books exist as the entirety of the thoughts or the notes or whatever format the book is in. So I do think that different formats of information exist for specific purposes, and not everything should just be squeezed into different cookie cutter shapes for stuff.
Right.
The other thing that we talked about in the Labs video was the Soldier of Fortune magazine.
Ah, yes.
The Soldier of Fortune magazine is another one of those 70s, 80s, 90s things that falls in a little bit of a black hole, which is not important enough to get turned into Time Life coffee table books. It's not going to get preserved the way that Time and Life and various other publications that documented World War II got turned into these big, heavy, substantial tomes, and those embedded reporters wrote books and they became important. But Soldier of Fortune magazine is interesting enough, and it was printed on paper, that copies of that magazine existed in people's attics and basements and got scanned, and so you can get those from archive.org. You can download. At this point, I think all of them. There were a couple of missing issues here and there, but people have cobbled those things together. So they just, if Soldier of Fortune had been an e-zine in the early or late 90s, say, or the early 2000s, it would be gone. It would not be backed up anywhere. But because there are still paper copies and people keep scanning them and uploading them, I think it's our responsibility to preserve those things, like the Irish monks, and keep circulating the tapes so that we don't lose that stuff. Not because Soldier of Fortune magazine is the hinge of civilization, but because there are some fascinating lessons learned that were documented by those reporters who were on the ground in Serbia and Croatia and different places, helping train. They were mercenaries, right? They were. Let's not beat around the bush. Soldier of Fortune means mercenary. A lot of those guys were mercenaries. They were being trained to hire different groups of people, and then they wrote articles about it. So it's a way more hands-on type of reporting than just being an embedded journalist.
Yeah, this is great. I just pulled one up and I'm looking at it.
Yeah.
This is what makes the internet great.
Yeah. When the internet, archive.org, I think, is doing good work. When the internet is saving and not just endlessly remixing, constantly revising, and constantly deconstructing and simplifying things down into tweets, the internet is great.
Yeah.
The modern tech tools are the constantly simplifying and deconstructing and then also sensationalizing and advertising.
Well, and they're also, I think they are, at some level, trying to do a good thing, because we're getting to the point where there is so much data.
Sure.
There's no way to manually go sort through it all.
Yeah.
I've on a couple occasions worked on some projects that had very, very large data sets, like huge archives of document scans.
Yeah.
But no organization. And finding what you want in there is a nightmare, because you're just clicking through, looking for the graphics that you're looking for. And so they are trying to take this immense universe of data and find a way to show you the things that you're most likely to click on.
Right.
Because honestly, if there was none of that, if it was just the raw data, people would get on, they would find it an incredibly clunky and frustrating process. They would never find what they want.
It would be like the pre-Google internet.
And they would all get off.
Yeah. The pre-Google internet was a fascinating place, but it was not user-friendly.
No.
There's a reason that Google was dominant, and it was their search and find capability.
Yeah.
Which they've now watered down a little bit because they have so many other services and products and so forth. But yeah, so I want to make it clear, I'm not a Luddite. I'm not wanting to go back to a simpler tool set or less powerful information tools.
Yeah.
The problem is the people and the way that they want to interact with the data and the way that they want to have control over the information is the issue. It isn't so much the tools that are the problem.
Yeah.
Even something like, I was critical of Reddit earlier, because people should be constantly 100% critical of Reddit all the time. But something like Stack Exchange shows that when you have questions and you're looking for answers, letting people upvote and have a nonlinear answer finding, answer sorting, that does allow the cream to rise to the crop. That is not a bad thing in and of itself.
Right.
That's just a bad way to do certain types of conversations.
Well, and I think that people have treated the internet and the way it does this cream rising, sorting stuff, showing you what they think you want to see. I think that we've been very, very trusting of this. Just been like, oh, this is how it works. And I think actually now the AI tools may give us a really good, give a lot of people a really great opportunity to actually see, wow, there's a lot of filters here. Because like you can go on there, and you try to have create Kermit the Frog holding a gun, and
It will not allow that.
it does not want to do that. Kermit the Frog in Vietnam,
We'll show you.
Kermit with an M16, but it obviously has all these things built in to prevent certain types of content from being generated that they deem inappropriate, and
Yes, I think.
and now people, anyone that goes and plays with AI is getting this. Like if
Yes.
you go over to ChatGPT and you're like, tell me about
Yes.
how Stalin killed all these people. Like, was Stalin an evil person? Well,
Yeah.
who's to say, really? And
the
you'll get the
biases.
moralizing and the bias, and you'll
Yeah.
get the, we can't talk about, there's never any circumstance in which it's appropriate to use force to defend yourself, so we won't write that story for you. And you get to see it
Yes.
firsthand and very, very concretely.
Yeah. And hopefully that does drive people not to abandon technological advancement and tools,
Right.
but to have a greater appreciation for the source documents and actual histories and actual human researchers.
Well, and just kind of a healthy dose of pessimism when you're like, wow, I go on my social media platform and this is what I'm being told. This must be reality right now. It's like, no, this is a slice of reality as shown to you by the algorithms.
Yes.
And so
Yeah.
it's more anecdote than data.
Yeah, and I think that that's only accelerating. And it isn't.
Yeah.
It isn't just the AI tools.
Right.
Obviously, I do really, really want a Muppet remix of Fortunate Son in the style of Platoon or Apocalypse Now, because that would be amazing. But we can't. The tools cannot generate that.
The thick of the jungle where the wild orchids grow, the Muppets took a stand when they had nowhere else to go. They sang of a war in a land far from home, a sardonic tune 'neath the vast jungle dome, in the mountains of the stand where the whispers weave.
However, I think people are noticing that there's a lot of stuff that was important enough culturally to be lauded and to be documented. So you will never be able to hide the fact that Gone with the Wind was made. And people are starting to notice that Gone with the Wind was made, but they're not allowed to watch it in a lot of places.
Yeah.
That actually, I think, generates more questions
Yes.
than answers. Soldier of Fortune magazine, we can pretend like it never happened, or we can pretend like it was something that it wasn't, and hopefully people will save copies so that we can actually know what the truth is. But when things get out of control and some of the most famous, the best documented, the most appreciated, the most culturally dominant ideas
Right.
are deemed inappropriate, it is very inconvenient to be confronted with these opposing ideas.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting where when you look at this whole idea of we don't like a thing, so we're going to suppress it. You look at Japan and Germany, and Germany with their anti-Nazi laws after World War II, which you get. But it's been interesting how it appears that suppressed their ability to know their history.
Right, yeah.
So maybe it started off with a good motive.
But you're forcing people to forget the history, so they will be doomed to repeat.
And in Japan, I don't know if they had a law, but they very clearly had a problem with teaching their people the history of World War II. And so the number of people that learned that history is, not that great. But I'm not sure if it was a law or just culturally you don't talk about the war, so it never happened.
Right. Well, even, I don't know what things are like today, but 10 or 15 years ago, we had friends who were fluent in both English and Japanese visit some different museums in Japan and be like, wow, the English placard and the Japanese placard say exact opposite things.
Yeah.
They are not, this is not a translation of that. These are wildly opposing takes written by the same museum for the exact same exhibit. And that is, in some ways, that is exactly what we're seeing on Twitter. The algorithm is smart enough to figure out that you lean conservative, and so you get a totally different set of captions on the exact same event. They figure out that somebody else leans the other way, and they get a completely different set of captions for the exact same event. So that is one of the ways that this this set of filtering tools and profiling tools does create these echo chambers where people have forgotten the past, in the hope that eradicating the past will prevent it from being repeated. They're really only
making it more likely.
Self-fulfilling prophecy stuff. Yeah. Well, thanks for the cheery, upbeat conversation about the future.
Do you want to talk servers?
Let's talk servers real quick, because the way to not forget the history and not repeat the history, the way to actually have foundations to build on, is to hang on to some of this stuff. So what do you recommend we do? I already recommended in the labs video that they get the Quicks software that lets them set up their own servers and download their own archives and get Project Gutenberg and Wikipedia and some of these offline things saved. And so what would you add to that?
Well, I would basically just say the good news is there's a lot of great tools out there now. There's a server operating system called Unraid. That's pretty cool. One of the problems with RAID arrays is that they exist for the purpose of redundancy, and that works pretty well right up until something breaks. And almost every RAID array I've ever had experience with ultimately has broken.
Yes.
And the problem is when it breaks, you may have a number of drives in the array, you lose too many, and now the other drives that didn't break, the data on them is irrecoverable, or it's practically, for most people, irrecoverable.
The data is broken up into such tiny pieces.
I have a drive, but I have fractions of the data, and there's no way to piece it back together. One of the cool things about Unraid is, let's say you have a computer, you put 6 hard drives in it, you say, I'm going to say 2 of the drives are my parity drives. They're basically the backup drives that will make it all work. And I can lose up to 2 drives and I'm fine. You lose 3 drives. The other 3 drives have complete copies of data on them. It's not going to be all of your data, but they're going to be complete files. So that's one cool thing about Unraid is it's a little bit more fault tolerant for noobs and for people that maybe don't have the ability to have a server here with redundancy and then a duplicate server somewhere else with redundancy, because that's really the way you start to get some really good resiliency, and ideally you air gap something. But Unraid is really cool. It's not free, but it's not very expensive. I want to say it's like $50, $100. They're in the middle of changing their licensing. And it'll run on a Windows PC. So if you have an old PC, hopefully not too ancient, it's got a bunch of SATA ports on the motherboard, you could install it on there. Well, actually, it installs on a thumb drive. It's really peculiar in that it runs off of a little USB thumb drive that you plug into the motherboard.
And all the drives get to be storage drives.
Yes.
Yeah. Nice.
So that's an option. There's also TrueNAS or FreeNAS. There's a couple different
There's a bunch of different ways to skin this cat.
Yeah, but one of the cool things is a lot of these will run off of just regular Windows PCs. And the cool thing there is most people probably have some old PCs
lying around,
and the main thing I would advocate for here is not to use a home grade computer for this project, because a lot of them are just not stable over the long term. But you can go get used business grade machines, like Dell Optiplexes, HP ProDesks and Elite Desks. Those types of computers, I literally
$200 on eBay,
or less. Like I literally just. So I'm the CFO here. I also do IT here, and so my desktop in my office was a Gen 4 i7, and just last week I swapped it out finally for a newer computer. And I was running I was choosing.
And how much did you spend for this fantastic computer upgrade for the CFO of a large company?
I think it was actually $600, but
okay, I thought
yeah. But
more expensive than I thought.
Yeah, but these used business machines are fantastic value. I was running a machine 10 or 12 years old, and I chose to run the oldest machine in the company just to prove it could be done. And mostly worked great, except
Yeah.
for not enough RAM.
Well, sure.
Not because
I blame Google for
but you
everybody
can
taking
get
too much
those
RAM.
But you can get those machines. Like if you go on eBay, you can go find like a Gen 6, 7, or 9 Intel processor, Dell Optiplex or HP Elite Desk, and it's going to be in the $100 range probably. And it's probably going to have, if you get one of the mid towers, it's going to have 4 SATA ports probably.
You had four drives in there.
Yeah.
Good backups.
Yeah, and I would, if a person wants to go out and do this from scratch, I would recommend that they buy a newer processor as a general rule. It doesn't need to be super high powered, but newer processors will draw less power at idle. And since you want this thing running 24/7, 365, 5 years, there's
Lower
a
power
big
stationary,
difference between a PC that has a base idling power draw of 90 watts and 8 watts.
Oh yeah, for sure. And now you can run that thing off of batteries. There's a whole bunch of new opportunities with better power consumption.
And so
yeah.
Yeah, so that's the great news. You could literally get a server up and running, $100 for the PC, either free server software or not, and then spinning disks have not actually been getting cheaper in the same way that they used to, and I think it's because in the old days every computer had to come with a spinning disk in it, right?
Oh yeah.
And so every bargain basement Walmart PC was going to have a spinner.
mass
Right.
production. Yeah.
Not anymore. Now the small SSDs they're cheap enough that everything's getting those instead.
Yeah.
And so my theory is that the volume that the hard drive factories used to get is just not there anymore.
Yeah.
But that's just a theory.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to see kind of what happens. I'm also looking forwards to somebody figuring out archival data mediums a little bit better, because spinning disks do not last forever, and the solid state drives do not last forever. The only things that last a really long time are actually CDs and DVDs. Those are surprisingly good.
But not burned
But
ones.
not the ones you can burn yourself.
No.
Difficult to actually have archival media that you can make yourself. Yeah.
So basically, if you want to archive stuff over a period of 10, 20, 30 years, you're going to have to upgrade mediums on a 5 to 10 year basis and move that stuff over, or else you risk the old media just dying, or you get to a point where you can't hook up the old media.
Yes. Yeah. So, well, that's a good project for people to work on. And then 50, 60 years from now, somebody will write a book, How the Old School Tech Nerds Saved Civilization Again, and it'll be cool.
One of the things that I find really interesting is with the current shift towards cloud is in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was this big debate of mainframes versus personal computers.
Yeah.
Is everything just a thin client connecting to the mainframe? And like when we'd go to the library, there would be these computers, and it was just a thin client.
Yeah.
Remember?
It
was like it was this little thin box, and it was like Citrix or something.
It had no storage, no processing.
And it purely connected to the mainframe.
Yeah.
And then, and I think it was because the internet speeds were not good enough, and Intel and AMD were making processors that were just getting better and better and better all the time.
Everything became a local computer.
Everything pivoted to PCs, personal computers. And then in the last
very short period of
time,
time.
It's been 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
It's been totally pivoting back to the mainframe approach.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's this really interesting thing with the corporate IT world where it's purely a mainframe, and people basically have an account that just connects to a hosted instance of their personal operating system. And it's great from a data retention, data security, because it lets people bring their own Chromebooks and just connect into the mainframe, and as long as the internet's good, it works.
And within a business, that makes sense, because the other great advantage that it gives you is control.
Yeah.
And if you have an employee and they're working on your, the company data, control is very justifiable. What I see happening, though, is people are putting their own personal data into Google. Google doesn't own that data, but Google just sort of assumes ownership of that data, and then Google takes total control over that data. And as long as Google plays nice, nobody thinks about the ramifications of that.
Right. So there's an idea that I'm playing with, like, well, what if we could flip it the other way? What if I could make my home be my mainframe?
Right.
So I have my own mainframe. So it's not necessarily so much like an archival server, but
you have control of the centralization. We decentralize everything up here, but you're still able to centralize your own stuff.
yeah. So like people like VPNs for a variety of reasons, right? For privacy and security and stuff. But what if you were VPNing back to your home, because your home has a great internet connection. Like we have fiber here now, which is amazing. And then your traffic goes home and then routes out to the internet from there.
Yeah.
You could now, have a degree of security that you didn't have before. If you could VPN into your home network, you could have access to your camera system that is not cloud connected.
Right. You can
Stuff
control
like that.
your
Yes.
SDRs and your
Yes.
HF radio that is connected to
Yeah.
your long range chat rooms.
Yesterday, I wanted to show someone here at work what Fusion 360 was like. So I was like, hey, watch this. And I just jumped onto my home computer and showed him. And it's kind of interesting how my office computer became the thin client to connect to my mainframe at home
Yeah.
to do this one little demo.
Yeah. So,
But it's becoming more feasible
Yeah.
to gain more control over your data and how it's stored and where it's stored. Yeah, it's very interesting.
yeah, I think that is going to be the future, or at least that is the way that we're going to need to preserve enough control that we can keep building towards the future. But we're going to keep working on some of these things. But the next time you come on the podcast, we're not actually going to talk about that.
Oh, okay. What were we going to talk about?
The next time you come on the podcast, we need to talk about the citizens defense industry.
Ah, yes.
The phrase that you came up with, the thing that the T-Rex has been trying to build for years and years. We've talked about it on a bunch of different podcasts and a couple of YouTube videos.
Right.
That's what we'll talk about on the next episode.
Oh, that'll be fun.
While we continue to, figure out how to preserve data, not lose stuff, and maintain control of our own devices, and then decentralize stuff. I mean, in some ways, it is the same conversation. The citizens defense industry is a decentralization of tools. Exactly the same as this is, but in a slightly different sphere.